Hi, everyone. My name is Leah Garrett, and today I'm going to talk about a book I wrote called X-Troop, The Secret Jewish Commandos of World War II. And I'm a professor and chair of Jewish history at Hunter College, CUNY. So the story I'm going to tell you today has never been told before, and it grew out of my own personal obsession with Jewish soldiers in World War II, based on an entire generation in my own family who served, including my grandfather, Abraham Klein, who was there in Europe during World War II. So to begin, let's go back in time to June 1942, when the Third Reich is at the height of its power. All of Western Europe has fallen. Rommel is driving the collapsing British army back towards Alexandria in North Africa, and the Russians are retreating east to Stalingrad. Even though America has entered the war on the side of the Allies, things are looking very bleak. Winston Churchill is desperate to fight back at the Germans by any means possible. And for the past 2 years, commando units have been conducting raids on the French coast. Still, things are not going well, and the British are losing, and they're losing badly. So when Lord Mountbatten comes to Churchill and suggests that they create a new special unit of commandos, different from anything that had been used before, Churchill's interested. So rather than coming from the ranks of the military, Lord Mountbatten suggests something new called the Inter-Allied Tend Commando. And what this will be comprised of is soldiers made of displaced nationals. There'll be a Polish troop, a Norwegian troop, a French troop, etc. And each of these units will have their own distinct uniform, although all of them will wear the famous green beret, and they're going to be used for different missions depending on their home languages. But they'll all be unified by the shared desire to drive the Nazis out of their home countries. So these highly trained, highly determined young men will be the tip of the spear when the liberation comes. But that's not all that Lord Mountbatten proposes. In this Inter-Allied 10 Commando Regiment, there's also going to exist an even more unusual and extraordinary group, one so valuable that they won't fight in their British or Belgian or Norwegian units. They'll fight somewhere else. This group will be given the distinct name X-Troop, and that's who I'm going to talk about today. The X-Troopers will operate on the front lines of battles and on raids against the Nazis, using their advanced fighting skills to kill and capture the enemy. And after the battle ends and the wounded are being cared for, the X-Troop, who are all going to be fluent in German, will interrogate the prisoners immediately, then and there, rather than wasting valuable time taking them back to the base. And the interrogations in German will aim to discover information that will assist the ongoing operation as it's unfolding. Where are the mines laid? How many troops are participating? Where are the machine gun nests? What weapons are they using? So the intelligence that will be gathered in the heat of the battle will be used to make crucial decisions in the next minutes and hours. And the X-Troopers will be the ones responsible for this. They will be unique, combining skill sets that usually do not go together. They're going to be advanced fighters like commandos, but also they're going to have counterintelligence training. They're going to be a combination of brains and brawn. And in fact, as I will tell you, that they end up being so important that they're only going to be deployed in small groups to other units because they don't want to be risked being wiped out in one battle. So only one group of men will fit the bill. They need to be German-speaking, they need to be highly intelligent, they need to be highly motivated to beat the Nazis. So who are they? They're the Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria who have been fleeing to Britain since Hitler's rise to power. Most of them are young men who come completely by themselves to the United Kingdom and are in the process at that time of losing their parents and their siblings, and in some cases, wives and children to the Nazis. They had been raised in loving middle-class families where being Jewish often played a minor role in their lives. And while each of them have a different story to tell, all the men who become ex-troopers, all of them have made their way to England as children. Many have suffered profound agonies about the destruction of their previous lives. Some of them are teenagers, some are a little bit older. They've come on kinder transport. They've been smuggled out by partisan groups. They were given false papers. They arrived in England as teenagers and young men, and they're generally completely alone. So the men of the ex-troop, who I'm going to explain sort of how they got trained and what they did, had to be, as I said, both heart and head. And their fury and focus was driven by the knowledge that every day the war continued, their families in Germany or in Austria were in hiding and were in peril. So this makes the story of the ex-troop also a story about the Holocaust and the transformation that these men went through, and the synthesis that they expressed was not easy because most of them had lost everything of their old lives, including their families, and they were now being called upon to transform from philosophy reading, intellectually minded refugees into fighters. And in order to be capable fighters, they needed to suppress their memories of the lost world to focus on the battle of hand. And after the war, many of them would continue to stay in their fake roles as Brits and not tell the world that they were Jewish, which made telling the story a little bit complicated and discovering the story. But this is a story of transformation about a group of men whose hatred for the Germans was so profound that they became these Jewish warriors who ended up soundly defeating them. So my book itself tells you about dozens of the men, but it focuses on 3 of them. And in order to write this story that I'm going to tell you a little bit more about now, I got to know 3 ex-troopers who were still alive when I wrote the book. I got to be very close with family members who had great archival material in their own homes. And I also did deep research at different places like the Imperial War Museum, the World War II Museum, and the Holocaust Museum as well. So once the decision was made that they would create this top secret unit, it wasn't hard for the military to find these men who had become the ex-troop. They just had to look into a place called the Pioneer Corps, where the men were then being used to unload trucks, build roads, clean bases, because at this point they were all enemy aliens. So when Churchill agreed to the plan, notices started appearing on mess hall boards calling for volunteers for special hazardous duties. And commanding officers were told to look for German-speaking refugees who were smart, who were physically capable, and most importantly, very eager to fight. And the anger of these ex-troopers was often palpable. Many of them had joined the Pioneer Corps after having been kept in detention camps. And I tell this dark story of British history that many people don't know about, which is the story before they became ex-troopers. So after the war started, 70,000 UK residents from Germany and Austria were overnight turned into refugees who are now considered to be enemy aliens. And even though out of the 70,000, 55,000 of them were actually Jews who despised the Nazis, they were considered a fifth column who could wage war on the British homeland, and they were potential enemies who needed to be dealt with. So by spring of 1940, Jewish German exiles were rounded up and put into detention camps. The camps ranged from the tolerable on the Isle of Man, as well as the horrific in places like Australia and Canada, where the Jewish refugees were sent along with Nazi POWs. So of the 55,000 Jewish refugees who escaped to England, more than 7,000 were forced into internment, and nearly all of these were the future ex-troopers because they were single young men, and that was to be the most suspect class of those who would be eventually the ones who became ex-troopers. So as I said, they were in internment camps in Australia, Canada, and the UK. And then finally, after America entered the war, they were given the option that they could leave the internment camp if they joined the non-combat Pioneer Corps. And because they were enemy aliens, they were not allowed to do any fighting. So they were not given arms. But once those signs appeared for hazardous duty, they put their hands up. So they were selected out of the ones who put their hand up, about 200 of them were selected to go to London. And they were interviewed by MI5 at a hotel there. And they were asked a range of questions and told that this would be very, very dangerous that they were undergoing. And all of them talked about the fact that the clock was ticking, their families were hiding, the war was personal, and Hitler had to be stopped at all costs. As one of the ex-troopers, Peter Terry, said later, we were actually looking forward to the killing because this would be them getting their own back. So in order to operate behind enemy lines, all of the men of the ex-troop had to undergo an extraordinary transformation. All of them were told that they had to pretend that they were British. They had to come up with fake British names. They had to come up with fake backstories about why they had German accents. Because the British military realized that if they were captured, this new commando unit, they would be killed instantly as Jews, and the Gestapo would hunt down any remnants of their family. So once they were accepted into the ex-troop, each man was given a couple of minutes to come up with a new Anglo-sounding name. So Hans Arnstein became Harry Andrews, Werner Goldschmidt became Vernon Dwelly, Stephen Hirsch became Stephen Hudson, and so on. Then they were told to destroy any connection to their old selves, burn every letter from home, throw out any books that had their names on them, because they had to sever these connections to the past. And for those who were killed in battle, this change would remain permanent because they had British names and all of them were fighting with Church of England dog tags. Those killed in battles were buried under crosses. And so one of the things that's come out of my book, Ex-Troop, is I've been working with members of the British military to change some of those crosses over to Stars of David's and to have their proper burials with their proper names now. So the change that was instigated was led by their commanding officer, the great Welshman, Brian Hilton Jones. He was not Jewish, but he understood the risk that his men faced, both as commandos and as refugees, and he decided that these men would be trained better and in a more thorough way than any other commando unit in the British Army. So the training that took place happened in Wales because that's where Brian Hilton Jones was. And you have a picture that you can see of them scaling a mountain. And days and nights were spent hiking over mountains with full packs and weapons, live ammo training on assault courses, cliff scaling, demolition work, parachuting. So outwardly, these were young English commandos who were learning both to how to interrogate the enemy and how to take him down. But it was also very complicated because they were actually Jewish guys from Austria and Vienna and Germany who were trying to master English. They were trying to hide their German accents. They were now suddenly found themselves thrown into Welsh homes with new food, new ways of acting, new manners of behavior. And they had to pretend that they were part of this world that was new to them. And they also were told that they couldn't talk about their real stories. Many of the men, though, found the training time the most exciting period of their lives, where they talked about the fact that they learned not only how to take apart a gun blindfold, but how to have the self-confidence that would be necessary to be leaders in their commando units. So the training took place from August 1943 until June 4th, 1944, and it formally ended with the D-Day landings. A few of the men had been selected earlier to do the Sicily landings, but the vast majority of them were sent to land at D-Day and to play a crucial role there. So when Operation Overlord began, ex-troopers were often the pathfinders leading the way into enemy territory, going door to door in French villages, killing, capturing, and interrogating POWs, undertaking night patrols into enemy territory, and using their powers of persuasion to convince hundreds of Germans to surrender, if not thousands of them. Often they were injured multiple times, and they would frequently just simply walk out of the field hospital because they refused to leave the fighting because they had to beat the Nazis because this was so personal. So 43 of the men of X-Troop were deployed to Operation Overlord. And as I said, it was quickly clear to the British military that these men were so extraordinary, they couldn't risk having them fight as their own unit. The Polish troop fought as its own unit. The men of X-Troop were deployed to all the other existing commando units in 2s and 3s to land with them and to lead the way. So one of the stories I'll tell you briefly about, and you can see the picture here, is of Peter Masters. He was originally from Vienna, middle-class family, and he wanted to be an artist. And when he was going down to the dock for the D-Day landings, he ran into another member of the X-Troop who said to him, "Peter, can you ride a bike?" And Peter said, "Yeah, in Vienna, I used to ride a bike everywhere." And then suddenly he found that he was deployed to land at D-Day on a troop called the Bicycle Troop. And you can see a photo there of them landing. So Masters and the other members of the Bicycle Troop were basically given the worst thing you could land on a D-Day beach at Sword Beach was a bicycle. They were heavy. Whenever you rode them, they would lock out. There was nowhere to put your backpack. And the idea of the men, the reason that they had to have these bikes, and you can see them in the picture, was the idea was that they would be the ones who, upon landing in Sword Beach, would be the first landing group to meet up and relieve Major John Howard on the famous Pegasus Bridge. So the idea was that Masters and the other Bicycle Troop members would land on Sword Beach and just immediately ride their bikes to Pegasus Bridge. And in fact, they did do that. And Peter Masters, this Viennese Jewish guy, was one of the first ones over Pegasus Bridge. And he and the troop were absolutely essential to the success that day, using their bicycles to lead their way. And in fact, Peter Masters ended up being so close with Lord Lovett that later, a few days later, when Lord Lovett was attacked and was hit by shrapnel and was nearly dead, it was Peter Masters and another ex-trooper who found him, rescued him, brought him to safety, and saved Lord Lovett's life. And they always stayed in correspondence with each other after the war. And I saw all the letters between the two of them. So Peter Masters was not alone. All the ex-troopers had to do this kind of essential work. A typical sort of way that an ex-trooper would work at D-Day was a man I'll talk about later called Montford Gons. And he landed with a commando unit, 3 commando on Sword Beach. They landed a bit late, and by the time they got there, it was complete carnage. Half of his commando unit died upon landing. Montford Gons had been trained so thoroughly, he knew the most important thing was to get off the beach. You have to get off the beach. Immediately, he took control of the rest of the surviving commandos, and he told them to follow him off the beach. As he came off the beach, he ran into 20 Germans with machine guns. And immediately he said to them in perfect German, because he was a German speaker, "Boys, you need to surrender and show me how to get off the beach." And they were so shocked to see this British commando speaking fluent German, who seemed to be in such control and authority, that they let him and the others safely off the beach, and they were captured. And that was exactly the idea of what the X-Troop were supposed to do. So as they make their way through France, I'm going to tell you about one other battle that they were essential in. They were essential in many of the battles. But another battle that was very important was the battle for Walcheren. And this island that was necessary because if you captured it, you couldn't get to Antwerp, which needed to be a port to supply the Allied troops. So Antwerp was important, but Walcheren, this little island on the way there, was just as important because unfortunately the Nazis had realized this as well, and they'd taken control of that island, making it very hard to get to Antwerp. So who's then sent to engage with the Germans on this little island? Again, it's ex-troopers leading the way. And I have a photo that you can see of this invasion. And the picture that you see there is of one of the ex-troopers, a guy named Maurice Latimer. And he was a Jewish socialist from the Sudetenland. And in the picture that you can see, he was the person who single-handedly took the essential tower that was filled with Germans that ended up being a turning point in the campaign. So after weeks of intense battles on this island, it was the ex-troopers who were there to lead the successful mission forward to Antwerp. And that's a picture of Maurice Latimer. And part of why I think this picture is so interesting is that all of us know that Holocaust photo of the little boy, the little Jewish boy whose hands are held up as he's been led away by Nazis with machine guns. This is the opposite. This is Maurice Latimer, a Jewish socialist, capturing the Nazis and making it so that the Allies end up being successful in the war. The last sort of person I'll tell you about in the European campaign, and then I'll tell you quickly about what happens afterwards, is a guy called Ian Harris, who, like the others, was devoted to getting rid of the Nazis. And the picture that you see is him capturing an entire division on his own by taking out a German leader. So this is what they did. And they were extremely central to the Allied success of the war, but no one knew about them because their story was so secret until decades after the war. However, the story of X-Troop did not end with VE Day. In the days after the war ended, many of the X-Troopers went back to their home countries to search for those who were in hiding. And one of the dreams that they all said they had was the dream of liberating concentration camps. So now I'm going to quickly tell you about one of the men I focus on the most, Montfort Gans, who I mentioned earlier, who caught all the men at the D-Day landing. And Montfort Gans, in the final days of the war, discovered that his parents, who had been in hiding, had been captured. He knew that already, and he knew that they'd been sent to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. But then he found out that his family had been moved to Theresienstadt concentration camp in Czechoslovakia. And so one of the stories I tell in the book, and I hope people will read it because it's extraordinary, was in the final days of the war, when there was still live battles going on throughout Germany, Montfort Gans went to his commanding officer and he said, I need a Jeep and I need a driver because I have to find my parents. And so over the next 4 days, while the battle raged, Montfort Gans drove through an apocalyptic wasteland filled with refugees, abandoned vehicles, Nazis, Germans, prisoners of war, and he made his way to Czechoslovakia, and he got his way into the concentration camp. And the story I tell, which he wrote down all of it in a diary that's kept in the Holocaust Museum that nobody had written about till I wrote this book, was finding his parents and getting them out of the concentration camp. And so I'm not going to go into the details of what that was like, but it was just, for him in particular, this extraordinary moment in his British uniform when he went into concentration camp and found his parents. And you can see the picture of him with his parents after the war in Israel as well. And the final thing I want to say about them after the war was it was the ex-troopers who were used to do the denazification efforts. They were the ones who were there to capture Nazis who were still in hiding. They took their guns and they searched them out in Germany and Austria. They were the ones who were given the task to get information for the Nuremberg trials. And they were the ones, particularly Montfort Gans, who did the interrogations of the high-ranking Nazis after the war because of, again, their German language skills their interrogation backgrounds, and so on and so forth. So to conclude, the X Troop were the only Jewish unit in World War II that fought their way into Nazi Germany and were an essential part of the Allied victory. The X Troop is a remarkable testament to the human ability to face the most extreme challenges while staying focused on the goal of righting a world that had gone terribly awry. And to end, when I was writing the book, I interviewed all these families of ex-troopers, and I spent a day with the family of Ian Harris, the person I mentioned who had single-handedly captured this entire group of Nazis. And one of the great stories about Ian Harris is that when he passed away well into his 90s, he said to his son, Mark Harris, at my military ceremony, I want you to do something unusual. And his son said, okay, Dad, what, tell me what it is, and whatever you ask me to do, I will do once you die. And this was written up in the Times. So they went and they had the military service, full service. And as the service ended, Mark Harris, his son, stood up, did the two fingers, and said, "Up yours, Adolf." And with that, I'll end, and I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Hi, Leah. How are you?
Nice to see you, Alex, and nice to see everyone. I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. That was a fab presentation. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. And the audience doesn't know this, but one of the great supporters of my books was Alex, so I'm very grateful to be here with you today.
Well, it's my pleasure. I really enjoyed our time together, and I loved your book. I have so many questions that I want to ask because you've entered into very precious territory, very emotional territory for me, which is the British Commandos. As you can tell, I'm a limey. You know that. Yeah. So I'm going to run through a few questions here we have for you, and then we can get into some really good discussion. First of all, John asks or points out that the ex-troopers sound like our Ritchie boys in the US who were trained at Camp Ritchie in Maryland. Can you contrast the two groups a little bit, please?
Yeah, I would love to do that because I actually had done a bunch of research on the Ritchie boys before I worked on this book, and then I found my way over to the X-Troop. They're similar in the fact that both are sets generally of German Jewish refugees, and they're both have men who are burning with a desire because this war is very personal to them to get there and to beat the Germans. But the X-Troop is completely different from the Ritchie boys in this very important way. The Ritchie boys are counterintelligence officers. The X-Troop is unique in sort of all of military history and in commando history as well, because they're dually trained. They're counterintelligence officers, like the Ritchie boys are, but they're also commandos. So they're trained in a double way. They're trained as commandos, but they're also trained as counterintelligence. So with the Ritchie boys, the idea was generally in military battles, when you captured the enemy, you would take them back and then you would do an interrogation. The X-Troop was supposed to be unique, and they were, and essential, because they were going to be the group that actually captured the enemy and then interrogated them on the battlefield to get precious intelligence in the heat of the battle. Where's the machine guns? Where just all of the information that they need in the heat of the battle. So the Ritchie boys are doing the counterintelligence. The X-Troopers are capturing the men as commandos, and then they're doing the counterintelligence while they're there in the battlefield. So they're doubly trained. Many of the men were taken away to Cambridge to do counterintelligence training, but they also go through the full and complete regimen of learning how to be commandos as well.
Great, thank you. We have another statement, this one from Wesley Johnson, and he says, one of our Jewish 7th Armored Division men who was captured told me that when it was clear that he was about to be captured, he threw away his dog tags that identified him as Jewish. Now, as you know, there are lots of stories like this, Battle of the Bulge, et cetera, et cetera. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so one of the really most intriguing parts of the story for me was about this transformation that all of the men had to go through. So just to sort of remember that they're young, they're 18, 19 years old. Most of them have come to the UK by themselves, either on transit visa programs or as kinder transport. Most of them have no family here. Very few of them are religious. Manfred Gans, who I talked about at the end, was Orthodox. He was Orthodox Jewish. Most of the men are from secular families in Austria or Berlin. They have some religious background, but not a deep religious background. So when they're brought in to do when they're selected and they're brought to Brian Hilton Jones and they're given, 5 minutes to come up with a new name and a new backstory. The other thing that happens at that moment is all of them are told that they're going to be given Church of England dog tags. So they all have to not only pretend to be British, but also to be Protestant, which is a utterly confusing transformation for most of them, as you can imagine. And so when I was writing the story of X Troop, that was one of the most interesting aspects of it, was that they were coming to this training with all of this horrific baggage. And then they were trying to pretend not only to be British, but to be Church of England. And so one of the many stories that I uncovered as I wrote the book was one of the key men in the group. He dies in the final days of the war, I think 3 or 4 days before the war ended. And he's given a beautiful ceremony on this hill where he's buried, and I have a picture of it in the book. And then atop of his body they put a cross. And I read the statement that they gave at the burial, and they talk about how he was a true Christian soldier for the UK. So it was so complicated what would happen to them, not only in battle but actually in death. And I mentioned this at the end, but part of what's happening with this book is getting some of them to be reinterred under Stars of David. But that sort of sounds negative, but the positive aspect of it was Brian Hilton Jones and the British military were completely cognizant of the danger that these men were in. I went through all of the war diaries, all of the papers, and there would be discussions of the ex-troopers. They never explicitly talk about the fact that they're all Jewish, but clearly they were deeply concerned about the danger that they would be in, because, as I mentioned, they would be killed for multiple reasons, not least of it which was because they were Jewish. So the idea of giving these men dog tags may make people uncomfortable now, but it made complete sense there, as the comment said, because it was a means to protect them.
So Clara says, I listened to your book on Audible. Grateful you've taught us about their incredible service. And then a really good question from Colin. How many of them were able to find their family members?
I always think about this when I think about it. I think that one of them finding their family members is more than I would expect at all. But the fact of the matter was that a handful of them were actually able to find their family members. So the number of men who actually served, it varies, but it's around 87 men. And I focus in the book, I tell the whole story, but I focus it through a handful of the men. And out of the handful that I talk about, I'll just quickly talk about 3 of them. One is Manfred Gans, and the whole sort of end section of the book is this incredible journey he goes on to rescue his parents from the concentration camp, which is extraordinary. And it made the rounds afterwards. So after the war, he went and helped with refugees, and they would say, did you ever hear that story about the British commando who saved his parents? And he thought, oh my God, it became a myth, but it was true. I tell the story of another man in the story who ended up being very important in the denazification efforts, whose sister was in hiding in Paris. And the day that Paris was liberated, he also went to his commanding officer and said, I need to go find my sister. And I should sort of mention again that the men were such leaders in the different commando units that they were assigned to, because they were always assigned to different commando units, that their commanding officers didn't know the story of who these men were, but they obviously had a sense of what was going on. So when he went to the French commanding officer to go to Paris and said, can I have a Jeep? Can I go find my sister? He was told yes, which is unusual, but he had been so heroic. He'd been shot. He'd walked out of a field hospital, kept battling. So he went and he found his sister, who was deep in hiding in Paris, and reunited with her. just the third story about sort of after the war that I always find really important about the X Troop is that these men fought very ethically. And their idea was that we will be ethical fighters and we will be different from the Germans. So one of the three men I focused most deeply on, who I didn't really talk about today, was a guy named Colin Anson, whose father was taken away to Dachau concentration camp right before the war. And after the war, he goes back to Germany. He finds his mother, and this is sort of another aspect of a search. And he decides he needs to find out who told on his father, who had his father put to death, essentially. And because he's in the denazification effort and he's part of the British military, he actually gets the information on the person who was responsible for his father's death, because that was his search to figure out what had happened to his father. And there's this incredible moment of moral clarity that he goes through where he says to himself, look, I could go find this guy and I could take him to the woods and I could shoot him because like I'm part of this British military. I could do that. And he said, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to turn him in. I'm going to follow the rules. So the sort of the quest to find their families, and then he did turn the guy in and he got him imprisoned. But the quest to find their families most often, unfortunately, would lead to finding family members who had been murdered. The unusual cases were Manfred Gans and the one who found his sister back in Paris. But for him, everyone else in his family had been murdered. So
the book, writing it and researching it must have been cathartic for you, given that your grandfather was part of the story. Can you tell us about how you decided to write this book?
Yeah, so I had written a previous book about Jewish American soldiers in World War II, focusing on the European campaign and focusing particularly on those who became writers. So I wrote a book about Norman Mailer and all these other men, Leon Uris, others who served, and sort of how they wrote about it after the war. And I thought I had the bug out of my system. And Alex says, I'm sure you know, the bug doesn't leave your system when you want to write about World War II. So then I wanted to write another book about Jewish servicemen, and I started to research this thing I'd heard about, this vague idea of a Jewish commando unit. And once I found the family members of one of the men I talk about, Peter Masters, the bicycle troop person I mentioned, it turned out that they were in touch with a whole network of other family members who were the children of ex-troopers. And that, in fact, that there were still ex-troopers alive when I wrote the book. There was 3 men still alive. And so as I started to kind of peel back the layers, I found that there was an extraordinary amount of archival information that was out there. It was housed at the Imperial War Museum, where a bunch of interviews had been collected in the 80s of these men. The Holocaust Museum in DC had the archives of Manfred Gans and Peter Masters. The World War II Museum, Ambrose had interviewed some of the men for the Pegasus Bridge book. So there was all of this material everywhere. And then there were the men still alive to interview. So I realized that I was actually working under a clock ticking, that I had to get this done quickly because there was men in their late 90s who were still alive. So I managed to interview 2 of the ex-troopers to write the book. And then I started to go to visit all the families, either in the UK or in the United States or in Canada. And then found on top of all this that I'm sure, Alex, as you know, that families also have incredibly detailed family archives that are just sitting in their like living rooms. So I gathered up all this information. But as I was writing the book, it became very evident to me that so many of the stories sounded too incredible to be believed that I couldn't just rely on the interviews that I had or the sort of family archival material. And I wanted to make sure that the veracity of all of that was evident with the archival material. So then I went to the National Archives at Kew, and I went through all of the war diaries to make sure that when somebody said, when Ian Harris tells a story about fighting the Hitler Jugend after crossing one of the rivers in Germany, is that actually detailed in the war diaries? Because I wanted to make sure it was actually, the dates were correct, it was all true. And the thing that was most astonishing was that the men were even downplaying how extraordinary they were. That Ian Harris would say, like, look, I shot 2 people. And then I would read the war diary and it would be like, there's this the incredible guy who like stormed the Hitler Jugend and he, killed 13 of them or whatever it was. And so I felt it was a very big task because the men were all assigned to different commando units. So I couldn't just go to the X Troop war diary. I had to go to, 4 Commando, whatever it was. So it was like working with, maybe 15 different war diaries, family archives, interviewing ex-troopers and talking to the children and trying to bring all that together to tell a compelling story that was really what I was intending to do was focus on the fact that I thought it was very important that these men really personified that the Holocaust and World War II were happening at the same time in the same spaces. And I had, at that point, Andrew Roberts wrote that great book about where he talks about World War II, but he talks about it at the same time as the Holocaust. And I thought that the story of these men was also very important, not only because they changed the course of the war, but they also reminded us sort of the bigger stakes that were at play as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. The idea that they were not bystanders or led to the gas chambers like sheep is important. So I'm being a bit facile here, but I don't care because I'm being a super World War II nerd. Can you react to the green object that I put in the chat? If you go back into the chat, you'll see a certain green object. It's green.
The green beret.
Yeah. Could you, and below it, we'll talk about the knife in a second, but just give us an emotional reaction to that beret, because if you're a Limey, if you're British, that's something that to wear that is it's better than receiving the Victoria Cross or being knighted by King Charles. I mean, that's a very potent object we're looking at there. Wouldn't you agree?
I'm actually getting shivers like looking at it because
do you have a green beret? Have you ever?
I don't have a green beret, but my husband's family is all British military, so there's a bunch of stuff in this room that I'm talking for. Like my husband's brother served in Iraq and Afghanistan for the British military, and he got that, as you can see, the flag from one of the battles. But anyways.
I thought you were going to show me a Union Jack. We don't.
I know. Sorry. Yeah. Well, we live here now, so it was a present. But what's interesting when I looked at the Green Beret is I was thinking that I visited all the family members I could of the ex-troopers, and they would always sort of share with me their material. And there was 2 things that I was always shown with family members. One was the Green Beret. The other was that Brian Hilton Jones, as I mentioned, wasn't a Jewish guy, but he was a guy who was an incredible leader. He loved his men. And I should add that, these were young men who had just lost their fathers, right? Most of them had lost their fathers and their brothers. So when we talk about band of brothers, they became a band of brothers to each other because their family members were being killed. But he stepped into the father role, Brian Hilton Jones did. Not intentionally. He was really tough. He was really sarcastic. He never said well done. And if he did, they just thought it was the greatest day of their lives that he gave them one nice word. And they loved him. So the thing that all of them kept after the war was the Green Beret. Or after the war, he wrote all of the men letters of recommendation. And the letters would always say things like, he was a true commando. And that to them was the deepest compliment they could ever get, along with the Green Beret, because it meant for them that the transformation had actually been successful. And you mentioned the fact that they were proactive, they were fighting the war, that they were not victims, they were actors who actually, as they said, regain their agency and change the course of the war. I mean, Montfort Guns would not have been able to go rescue his parents, but for the fact that the ex-troop had been so crucial at the D-Day landings or at Walcheren or wherever it was. So it was like they changed the course of the war, and they felt that emphatically. And when Brian Hilton Jones wrote that letter and they had their Green Beret, that was it. And many of them said to their children, and we hear this a lot with veterans of World War II, these were the key moments of their lives. I mean, and the things that they were most proud of, as they should have been, actually. Just one final thing, because these were the guys, like I said earlier, who would always put their hands up for the most dangerous missions, always wanted to be at the forefront to do whatever it took, because they were fighting the war differently because it was so personal for them. And they all knew, like Montfort knew, every day the war goes on, my parents might be killed at the concentration camp. I need to get this war ended now to get my parents. So that sense of it being a personal mission and a bigger mission was completely personified by the letter from Brian Hilton Jones or the Green Beret.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I mentioned the beret, and I think one of the things that comes out of your book very strongly, is this notion that by wearing that beret, by becoming a commando, you have these refugees, these extraordinary people coming from different backgrounds, different classes, different ethnicities, and yet, as Lovett said, we were all men joined on the same rope, all codependent completely. In combat, it didn't matter. You just had to get the job done, which is a wonderful thing when you think that the British Army provide that kind of equality. But then it brings me on to my next image that I posted here, facetiously, perhaps a little bit. But anyway, I'm going to ask you a very difficult question here. It doesn't matter if you can't answer it. What is the correct way for someone to use the Fairbairn Sykes commando knife? I'm sorry to put you on the spot there.
Oh my God, I have no idea. But I was about to comment on Lord Lovett and say, oh my God, did the men love Lord Lovett? That's what I was going to say.
Well, he's a superstar. I think I posted a picture later on. He's there just after.
Yeah. I mean, I remember like at the D-Day landing, I read about this in the book, that one of the guys I read about, amazing guy, I love him, but one of the guys I read about said like he saw Lord Lovett stand there and he like slipped behind Lord Lovett and he touched his belt, because they all, as you know, they all thought that he had this magical quality, and if you touched Lord Lovett's belt, you would be safe. And so they all thought that he had this magical essence, and they just thought he was just such a complete superstar, particularly for the X Troop, because he treated them, like you said, like that they were worthy and valiant and equal to everybody else.
Yeah, and the fine point of the British Army, as he said on the evening of fine cutting edge of the British Army, as he said on the evening of the 5th of June. That photograph that I placed there is after Dieppe, and remarkably, when he landed on Sword Beach on D-Day, that was only his 3rd day in combat.
And actually, I didn't go into it here, but the X Troops' first mission was actually Dieppe.
Right.
So
wow.
They were there. They were being sent there to try and get sort of classified German material, and the X Troopers were sent there were all captured. It's I thought this was a very interesting story, and I went and I found their MI5 top secret material. They were captured and were sent to German prisoner camps, and MI5 was really worried that their cover would slip, and they were tortured and they were treated as one would expect, and none of them slipped their cover. They all kept their cover throughout the war and pretended that they were British commandos and that they weren't these Jewish guys in this super group that was there to gather intelligence.
Which brings me to Masters, and I've again placed an image there of Lord Lovett's memoir, March Past, which me, and I am biased obviously, is one of the most beautiful memoirs of World War II ever written. There's a section in that which connects to Masters. It's when Lovett has been really very badly wounded by shrapnel. I mean, I think literally a third of his stomach was gouged out by a German shell. And during the narrative, Lovett mentions that he had to bury maybe a dozen of his fellow officers, and he said that they buried them in an apple orchard, and they tiptoed out of the orchard lest they wake the dead. It's an incredible moment. You can imagine the grief, the sense of loss. Tell us a little bit about the relationship between Masters and Lovett.
Can I just say, no one's ever asked this question. I'm very excited to talk about this. This is such a good question. Because Masters harassed Lovett throughout his life in a very friendly way to say to Lovett, look, we were the first ones across Pegasus Bridge. And I read all the letters between the two of them because, there's the whole myth. Of course, you know about the whole myth about who was first across the bridge. And Peter Master was like, wait, we were first across the bridge. But so they all look up to Lord Lovett. Because like I said, they're all in different commando units. And so when Lord Lovett is injured, it's Peter Masters and another ex-trooper who carry him away and rescue his life. And then there was this big question, it sounds ridiculous now, but it was an important question then, about what about Lord Lovett's walking stick? And it was actually apparently Peter Masters who got his walking stick and had it protected until after the war and got it back to Lord Lovett. So they stayed very close after the war, but Peter Masters was always asking just a little bit of acknowledgement about what these men did, but out of complete and total respect. And Lord Lovett wrote him so many letters that I saw in a file in Peter Masters' in his house that his wife, who's still alive, sort of felt was actually too intimate to even give to the archive at the Holocaust Museum. So that was the relationship. So they stayed in touch, and Peter Masters was always trying to get a little bit of validation for the role of these ex-troopers within the bicycle troop. But like I said, I don't know if the story is true about the walking stick, but that's one of the many sort of anecdotal things about Lord Lovett and the ex-troopers.
Yeah. I'll just add that I came across an amazing YouTube video when I was researching my book called The First Wave. Let's not talk about me too much, but anyway, it was incredible because it was this Cockney. All right, Ed, how you doing? You all right, mate? Like that. And he was explaining how to use the dagger, the commando dagger. And I can just imagine one of your ex-troopers using the dagger. And the way that you used the dagger was that you didn't stab and slash. What you did was you grabbed the Nazi and you pulled him onto the blade. So you used the weight of the German and you pulled that man onto the blade. So that's how you use the Fairbairn. Anyway, we're starting to run out of time here. I have to say, Leah, that we've had so many comments here. You've gone down extremely well. It's a wonderful presentation. I just wanted to thank you on behalf of Friends for being with us and for such amazing work. It's more important than ever to recognize these pioneers of justice in World War II. And I hope that you'll join us again at some future date.
I'm writing a book now. I don't know. I think, Alex, I told you this, but I'm writing a new book right now on the American combat nurses who were at Iwo Jima and Okinawa.
Yeah, I gave you a contact for one of them. Did you?
Oh, that's right, you did. Okay, sorry. It's been a very difficult in this world I live in. Yes, you did. You gave me a contact information. So if anyone in the audience has family members, email me directly because I'm writing the story. I'm well underway, but I know Alex feels this way too. But we just have to keep writing about World War II. Well, there's anyone, and one last thing, Alex, I've noticed it's not only now that, unfortunately, many of the veterans are passing away, but also the archival material in family homes. We need to get at it while it's still in good condition so we can look at the information. So